Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we started refactoring our world scene in support of multiple areas in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the clear source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. So now that we've finished refactoring our world scenes to support dynamically creating the correct tile map data and correct image game objects based on the area of the game where our player is currently at, the next thing we need to do is we need to add support for when our player interacts with one of our entrances to go ahead and restart our scene and pass in that data to that correct area. So as an example, if my player wants to interact with this door here, we should go ahead and restart our world scene, and then in our world scene data, we want to go ahead and pass that the area we're going to is going to match the data we grab from that tiled object here. And so to go ahead and start adding support for this, what we'll need to do is we'll need to go ahead and grab that object layer from our data. And so in our world scene, what we'll do is first we'll go ahead and add that to our class. So I'm just going to copy this here. Instead of wild monster encountered, we're just going to do entrance layer. And what we'll do is copy that. Let's place that above it. So now what we'll need to do is let's come down to our create method where we create our layers. And so after we create our collision data and we check for our signs, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll add in support for checking if our object layer for scene transitions exist. So let's go ahead and add a comment. We'll do create layer for scene transitions, create layer for scene transitions entrances. And so what we'll do const and we'll do as scene transition layer, and we're going to set the equal to our map. We want to go ahead and do get object layer, and we're going to go ahead and do scene transitions, and then we just make sure it's not set to null. And so if it's not null, we'll just do our if statements. We'll do has scene transition layer, and then we'll go ahead and assign it. So we'll do this. Our entrance layer is going to be equal to our map get object layer scene transitions. So then what we'll want to do with this data is with our new layer, we'll need to pass this to our player class. And then that way, as our player is moving around, we can see if our player is actually going to interact with that layer. And so what we'll do is we'll come down to where we create our player, and we'll go ahead and add a new property. And so we'll do entrance layer, and we're going to set that equal to this, our entrance layer. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and jump over to our player class. All right, so what we'll need to do is we'll need to update our player config to allow us to go ahead and specify this property. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and make a new object to have some of these properties, and then we'll go ahead and just extend that by adding that on here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do and we'll do player config props, and we'll do player config, and we'll do props, and we'll go ahead and define that. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to paste over a property real quick. And so for our new property, we'll call it player config props. It's going to be an object. And then so what we're going to do is we're going to add a few properties. The first one's going to be to our collision layer. So for our player class, we expect this to be defined, and it's not going to be optional. And so we're just going to go ahead and override our default value on our character config, because there it's defined as optional. And so that'll be our phaser tile map layer. The next one we're going to add is this entrance layer that we're working on adding now. And so that's just going to be our phaser tile maps object layer. And then we're going to add one more, and this is going to be our enter entrance callback. And so what this is going to be used for later is when our player interacts with one of our objects on our entrance layer, then we need to go ahead and notify our world scene that the player is trying to enter that space. And we'll come back to this more once we add in our logic. And so by doing this, this allows us to go ahead and extend our player config type definition easily by just adding in this new object and adding in our new properties that are either new to this config, that are new to this type, or they can override our values we previously provided, like in our character config. And so this just make it a little bit easier to organize what we want to add to our player without having to keep adding new properties on and on and on here. Just makes it a little bit easier to read. All right, so now we have our two new properties. What we're going to do is we're going to add two private properties to our class to keep track of those. And so for our first one, this will be our entrance layer. And then our second one will be our enter entrance callback. So I'm just going to copy this. We'll go ahead and paste. And then we'll go ahead and add in our types. And so for our first type, for our entrance layer callback, This is going to be our object layer. I'm just going to copy that. We'll go ahead and paste that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy our callback definition here. We're going to replace that for our enter entrance callback. So then in our constructor, after we call our super method, let's just go ahead and assign those properties. And so we'll have our entrance layer will be equal to our config, and we'll grab our entrance layer, and we'll do this. We'll grab our enter entrance callback will be equal to our config, and we want our enter entrance callback. All right, so real quick, what we're going to do is we're going to jump back to our world scene, and we're just going to go ahead and add in our new property that we said is required. So this will be our enter entrance callback. And so what we'll do is we'll just make a new callback, and we'll have it do nothing for the time being. So now we jump back to our player class. What we want to do is after our player has moved, so when we call our move character method and we play our animations, we want to go ahead and check to see if our player was trying to move into one of our entrances. And so when we built our map data, we left our door as part of our collision layer, so our player can't actually go into that space. And so after we play our animations and update our player's position to face that direction, we want to see if that position the player was trying to go to was one of our entrances. And if it was, then we go ahead and transition to our world scene and try to go to that next area. So in order to do this, down in our move character method, after our switch statement, the first thing we're going to do is make sure our character is no longer moving. So if the player has now came up to one of our entrances and they're done moving because they're colliding with it, now we'll go ahead and do that check. And so we'll do this and do is moving. So if our character is no longer moving, then we want to go ahead and grab our target position based on the direction our player is facing. And so we want to go ahead and grab our position right above our player and see if that actually has an object in that location. And so to do this, we'll do our const, and we're going to do target position is going to be equal to get target position from our game object position and direction. And so for our position, we'll do our X value. It's going to be this, our phaser game object. Our X position, Y, will be this, our phaser game object, Y position. And then we want to go ahead and pass in the direction of our player. So then once we have our target position, we can now check our entrance layer for objects to see if there's one in that position. And so what we'll do const, and we'll do nearby entrance is equal to this, our entrance layer. We want to grab our objects from that layer, and we want to do the find method. And so what we'll want to do is we want to go ahead and do our object, and in our callback, we want to make sure that our object has our X and Y value. So if our object does not have our X or our object does not have our Y, we can go ahead and just return early. So we'll do return false. Otherwise, we want to make sure that object's position matches our target position. So we're just going to do return. We'll do our object.x is equal to our target position.x, and we'll do our object.y minus our tile size, because of how the positioning works in tiled, is equal to our target position y. Then we'll go ahead and return true there. And so then what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're just going to do console log. We'll do nearby entrance. And so another thing we'll want to do is we actually need to make this property optional, because in our world scene, when we create our entrance layer, there's a possibility it's undefined, because we check to make sure we actually have that layer. So in our player class, up in our config, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and make this optional, and we'll keep our enter entrance as required. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and we're just going to say this can also be undefined. So then down in our code, what we'll want to do is if we're not moving and this dot entrance layer does not equal undefined, then we want to go ahead and do our logic here. All right, so we go ahead and save. We should be able to test our changes. So if we come to our world scene, what we'll do is let's come up to our door. And if we press up, we'll see right away we get a bunch of new console log statements. And so now we can see our codes working where our player, we can see our target position because we hit the up button. We're trying to go into that space. And now that we've grabbed our entrance object, we can now use our properties to know which area of our game we now need to load. And so we can see we have our building 1 and we have our entrance ID, and then we can pass that to our world scene so we can load in that data. And just to make sure everything's working, if we try to go up on our building in a different location, you see now we have undefined. All right, so what we'll want to do is let's get rid of our console log statement, and we're just going to add an if statement. We'll do if there's no nearby entrance, we can go ahead and return. We don't need to do the rest of our logic. And then otherwise what we'll want to do is now we need to grab those properties and provide them to our world scene. So I'm just going to add a quick comment, and we'll do entrance is nearby, and the player is trying to enter that location. And so now we just need to grab those properties, and so I'm going to do const, we'll do entrance name. We're going to set that equal to our nearby entrance. We want to grab our properties. And now we're going to use the find method. And what we'll do is we'll do our property. And we want to find our property where the name is equal to connects to. And then we want to grab that value. So real quick, if we expand one of our properties here, if we expand one of our objects here, we have our 3 properties. And so we have connects to, entrance ID, and is building. And for our values, this is what we want to grab. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that line of code. I'm going to paste it twice. And then what we'll do is we'll do our entrance ID. And we will have is building entrance. And so we will go ahead and change this to entrance ID. And we'll change this to is building. So then what we'll do is we'll do on our enter entrance callback. And we'll provide our entrance name, our entrance ID, and is building entrance. Oh, and so we have an issue with our types. Let's come up here. Yes. So we also need to add that here. And so we'll have is building entrance, and we're just going to do this as Boolean. And then let's add that up to our config up here. All right, so now we've updated our player class. What we need to do is back in our world scene, when our enter entrance callback is invoked, this is where we'll need to go ahead and restart our scene with our appropriate data. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is first for our callback, let's add in our 3 parameters that we're expecting. And so we're going to have our entrance name, we're going to have our entrance ID, and then we're going to go ahead and have is building entrance. So in our callback, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I want to make a new private method on our class, and I'll go ahead and handle all this logic. And so what we'll do this, we'll do handle entrance entered callback, and we'll go ahead and pass in our entrance name, entrance ID, and is building entrance. So then what I'm going to go ahead and do is just going to copy this. We'll come down to the bottom of our class. Let's go ahead and add in our new private method. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in our types. And so for entrance name, this will be a string. Entrance ID will be a string. Our is building entrance is going to go ahead and be a Boolean. And what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and return void for this method. So just make sure everything's working. I'm just going to do a quick console log. And so we'll do entrance ID, entrance name, and we'll do is building entrance. So back in our scene, what we should be able to do is if we come up to our door, if we press our up key, we can see now our callback's being invoked and we have our data. So what we're going to go ahead and do is when this method is called, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and lock our input. Because what we can see is as our keys are being held, we're calling this callback multiple times. And so what we'll do this, we'll reference our controls, we're going to go ahead and lock our input and set equal to true. So now what should happen is when we try to interact with our door, we should get our 1 callback, and then we shouldn't be able to get it anymore, and our player can't move around. So now we verified our callback's working, what we need to do is we need to figure out what new location our player is going to be in when we load in our new area. And so when we want to restart our scene, one of the things we do is we grab our player's location from our data manager. And so we need to go ahead and update our data manager to have our player's new location relative to where they enter that door in our new level. And so to figure all this out, what we'll need to do is we'll need to go ahead and grab our tile map data for the area we're trying to go to, so our building 1, and from there we need to grab our scene transitions object layer. And with that object layer, then we can figure out which entrance ID we're now entering, and then use that to calculate our position. Once we have our player's position, we can put that in our data manager, and then we can go ahead and restart our scene and pass in the appropriate data for the area we're going to. And so to go ahead and do this, the first thing to do is let's go ahead and grab our tile map data. And so we'll do const map is going to be equal to this make.tilemap. All right, so for our key here, what we'll want to do is we want to go ahead and use our entrance name that was provided, and we want to call the to uppercase method on it. So similar like we did above, similar like what we did before, we loaded in our world level data, we need to go ahead and make this uppercase so it matches our asset keys. So then after we grab that value, make it uppercase, then we want to go ahead and add our suffix for level. And so the reason we need to grab our tile map data is when our scene starts, we're only creating our tile map data for our existing level. And so in this example, we're in our world scene, so it's going to be main_1 level. And because we're trying to go to building 1, we now need to grab that data and create our tile map data from it. So then after we have our map, we now need to grab our entrance object layer from this map instance. And so we'll do const, we'll do our entrance object layer. We're going to set that equal to our map. We'll do get object layer, and we're going to go ahead and do our scene transitions. And so once we have our object layer, we need to go ahead and grab the object of the entrance that matches the one we're trying to enter. And so to do that, we're going to do our const, we'll do our entrance object is be equal to our entrance object layer. We want to grab our objects, and then we want to go ahead and find the particular object that matches the entrance ID we are going into. And so we're going to go ahead and make a few variables. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to our player class, and I'm going to copy our lines for our entrance name and our entrance ID. And we're going to paste those here. I'm going to go ahead and change this to temp entrance name, and we'll change this to temp entrance ID. And then we want to go ahead and change this to be our object, and we'll grab our properties from that object. And now with our temporary entrance name and ID, we just want to find the one where our temp entrance name is equal to this, our scene data, and our area. So in our building on the inside, we know our door, our entrance, will connect to our area 1, and so our area we're currently in should match that. And so we'll have our area, and we want to grab the one where our temp entrance ID is equal to our entrance ID that we provided in our callback. And so that's going to be the ID of our door. So before when we build our data, we add support for multiple entrances. And so if we enter through the front door here, we need to find that door in our building. And if we had an option for like 2 doors or a back door, then we want to find that appropriate one. So now what should happen is now we should have our entrance object, and with that data, we can figure out our location. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to add a console log, and we're going to do console log our entrance object, just so we can test our code. So now back in our scene, if we come up to our door, we should see our callback with our data, and we do see our one object that we found. If we check our properties, we can see that our connects to our main 1, so that is the right entrance, and our entrance ID should be 1, so it matches with the ID we provided here. Perfect. So then I'm going to go ahead and clean up our console logs, and now that we have our entrance object, we can use that to calculate our player's position. And so what we'll do is we'll do let x is going to be equal to our entrance object, and we'll grab our x value, and we'll do let y is going to be equal to our entrance object, and we want to go ahead and grab our y value and subtract our tile size. Since our y value will be the bottom right hand corner, we want to come up, so then that way we're at the top position when we place our player. So then what we want to do is with that location, that's the location of our object. We don't want to place our player right on the entrance. Instead, we want to place them one tile above where that entrance is. And so what we'll do is we're going to check our player's direction, and depending on if they're facing up or down, we would have them enter and move that many spaces up or down so they're in front of the door. And so what we'll do if our player direction is equal to direction up, then we want to go ahead and shift our player up one tile space. And so we'll do our y will be minus equal to our tile size. And otherwise, if our player is facing down, we want to go ahead and increment it so that we can move them down on our map. And this will make more sense once we actually do our transition, but that's what we're doing here. All right, so finally, now that we have our position that we need, now we can actually go ahead and transition to our next scene. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to do our data manager. We're going to go ahead and call our store method. We'll reference our store. Let's go ahead and call set, And what we'll do is we want to store our new position. So let's go ahead and grab our manager store keys. And we want our player low position. And we're going to go ahead and use our X and Y that we just calculated. Finally, we'll go ahead and restart our scene. And so we'll do this. We'll do our scene. And we want to restart our scene keys and our world scene. Then we need to go ahead and pass in our data for our area. And so we'll just make a new variable. We're just going to call this data to pass. So what I'm going to do const, we'll do data to pass. It's going to be equal to an object. I'm just going to throw in our type real quick. And so for our type, we need our world scene data. So now what we can do is for our area, we can grab our entrance name that we provided to our callback. And then for is interior, we can do is building entrance. All right, so real quick, so what we ended up doing in our callback is the first thing we did is we took our data that we received from our object layer we're trying to interact with, and based on that, we went ahead and grabbed the appropriate tiled map JSON file, so then we could find our entrance of where our player needs to enter when we load in that level. Once we figured out that position, we went ahead and stored that in our data manager, and now we're just going to go ahead and call the start method on our scene to go ahead and restart our scene, and we passed in our new scene data, so then that way we know which area data we need to load. And so with those changes, we should be able to go ahead and test. So if we come to our scene, let's go ahead and have our player navigate to our building. We try to enter, and so what we can see right away is we now load our level 2 data, but our player is not positioned how we thought. Yes, so in our code, we actually have a bug. So what we should do is we want down. All right, so after we fixed our code, let's go ahead and try entering our building again. Perfect. So now when our player enters our building, we can see they're on our entrance map. And so the reason we added our code here for moving our player was if we use our entrance layer right here and we have our player position there when they come in, it's going to look really weird because our player is not actually in our building. They're actually be on top of our collision layer. And so for our transition, we want it to look like the player actually entered our building. And then that way we can then move our player out of our scene when they come back to enter in with our entrance. All right, so if we go ahead and test trying to go back to our world scene, we'll see we have an error. So for our errors in our player class, we'll grab is building. Okay, so what happened here is in tiled, when we add one of our custom classes to our tile object, what will happen is by default, tile's going to add the properties that we need for our custom class. However, it doesn't always add in default values if one's not specified. And so an example of this is our is building here is currently grayed out. So what tile did is it added that property, but when we export out our data, because it's not white, it's not actually going to show up in our exports. And so this data is actually missing. And so to go ahead and fix that, what we need to do is actually click our checkbox. And then if we deselect it, what will happen is now we see our properties white and it has a value of false. So now when we export out our data, we'll actually have that in our code. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and save. And I'm going to go ahead and re-export this out as our JSON file. And so we'll have our building 1, and we'll have JSON. All right, so if we export our data, let's come back to our game. If we go ahead and import that into our data folder, we should be able to go ahead and save and test. So now if we come up to our entrance, if we go into our building, if we try to leave, we can see now that we transition to our world scene. And so another way we can handle this, if we come over to our player class, what we can do is we can just add a fallback. So if our building entrance, if we cannot find this property, what we'll do is we'll just do this, and we'll do a fallback, and we'll go ahead and do false. All right, so go ahead and save and test. We should see that we have one more issue we need to fix. And so if we come to our world scene, it looks like our bounds on our camera is not working properly. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and come up to our init method. And after we go ahead and set our scene data, let's go ahead and log that out. And so we're going to do console.log. We'll do this, our scene data. We'll go ahead and save. And so now when it starts, we can see is interior is false. Perfect. We're in main 1. We go into our building. Interior is true, and we're in building 1. And if we come outside, is interior is true. That's an issue. All right, so what's happening is in our init method, we're setting is interior equal to scene data is interior if it's set. However, because it's a Boolean value, if it evaluates to false, it will go ahead and run our OR statement here. And so what we actually want to do is we want to go ahead and set is interior will be equal to our scene data is interior. And what we'll do is we're just going to check to see if it's undefined. So if is interior is undefined, then we want to go ahead and add our fallback. And so we'll just go ahead and get rid of this. Let's copy this. We'll place that in our if statement, and we'll set is interior will be equal to our data manager. So now our scene should refresh. We're back where we previously left our game. We'll go into our door. Perfect, interior is working. If we go outside, nice. Okay, so now we're in front of our door, and our camera bounds is working how we expect. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this console log, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to our create method. We're going to clean up some of this code here. All right, just to make sure everything's working end to end, I'm going to jump over to our preload scene. I'm going to come down to where we start our scenes. I'm going to go back to our title scene. And so after our game starts, I'm going to go ahead and do a brand new game. So we should be in front of our house, and everything should still be working properly. Perfect. Let's check our collisions, and if we can interact with our sign layers, nice. And let's go ahead and talk to one of our NPCs. Oh, come back here. All right. All right, let's go ahead and test our second building. If we go into our building, oh, we can see our potted plant. Perfect. And we can still collide with our items, and we collide with our wall. Nice. And let's go ahead and go back to building 1. We go in. You don't see our plant. Perfect. And collisions are working. Nice. All right, so one last thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a nice transition for when our player enters into one of our buildings. So currently, in our world scene, once we detect that we're going to go ahead and go into one of our buildings, we immediately start transitioning to our next scene, and we just kind of cut off and transition. But when we go to our next area, we have that nice fade-in effect. So what we're going to go ahead and do is before we go ahead and go into our building, we're going to go ahead and have our scene fade out, and that way it just looks really nice. So what we'll do is down in our handle entrance entered callback, before we go ahead and call our scene start method, we'll go ahead and just create a fade out effect for our camera. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is we'll do this. We'll reference our cameras, and we'll do our main camera. Let's go ahead and do fade out. And what we'll do is we'll do a duration of 1 second. We want to go ahead and go to black, so we'll use 000 for our RGB. And then for our callback, we'll get our camera instance and our progress. And then what we'll do in our callback is we're going to just make sure our progress is set to 1. And so if it is equal to 1, then we'll go ahead and do our logic. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy all this code here. We're going to place that inside our if statement. And we'll go ahead and save. So now if we go ahead and test, when we go into our building, we get this very nice fade out effect. And we fade into our next area. Likewise, we can go from our building to our world scene. Nice. Alright, so one last thing we need to do is while we refactor some of our code tied to our layers when we parse our tile data, is we introduce a new bug tied to when we encounter monsters in our game. So if we go ahead and try to enter one of our encounter zones, one thing we'll notice is now we no longer have our console log when our player is in the encounter area. And so what's happening is we're not actually creating our encounter layer because our encounter isn't actually an object layer. So when I copied and pasted some code before, this is not what we actually want. Instead, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and get layer index by name. And what that's going to do is it's going to check for all of our layers for a given name. And if it's not found, null will be returned. Otherwise, it's going to go ahead and give us the index of the name we provide. And so now if we go ahead and save, we should be able to test our changes. So we go to continue. I'm going to go ahead and enter our encounter area. And you'll see right away, we see now we're in a zone and we encounter a monster. All right, so one additional bug we need to take a look at is if we go into one of our houses and we try moving around, we see we get an error. And this is tied to our tile map layer. And so what's happening is currently in our world scene, we have a few properties that can be undefined. And these are going to be our layers from our tile data. And what happens is in our create method, we go ahead and set these values on our class. But then when we go ahead and restart our scene, Phaser doesn't actually create a new instance of our scene. Instead, it reuses the existing instance and it re-triggers the appropriate lifecycle methods like init and create. And so what this results in is when we go to move inside our house, because we've already set one of our layers, however, that layer doesn't exist in this scene, we're still trying to process it. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and unset that reference when our scene starts. So then that way, when we restart our scene, we won't have a reference to that non-existent layer. And so to do this, it's actually pretty easy. We just need to come down to our init method. And after we set some of our properties here, we're just going to go ahead and add in our properties for our map, tile map data, so we can go ahead and reset that. So what we'll do is we're just going to do this. We're going to do our encounter layer first, and we're going to set this to undefined. Then we're going to go ahead and do our sign layer. We'll set that equal to undefined. And then we're going to go ahead and do our entrance layer, and we'll set that to undefined as well. And so by doing this, every time our scene starts, we're going to go ahead and make sure these are undefined. Then that way they only get set in our create method if they actually exist for the level data we're loading. So if we go ahead and test one more time, go into one of our buildings, we'll see now when we move around, our player's actually able to move around that level after we've loaded that initial level data from the main map. Alright, with that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to work on refactoring some of our logic tied to our NPCs, and what we're going to do is we're going to add support for an event structure for NPCs, so that way we can do more than just talk with our NPCs, such as have our NPCs battle us, heal our team, trade items, and more. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please on the links on your screen now.